The September sun was just beginning to rise over the rolling hills of Clearwater Valley, Colorado, as Robert Bobby Hayes drove his pickup truck along the dusty gravel road that wound through the mountainous terrain surrounding his ranch. At 46, Bobby had the solid build and weathered hands of a man who'd spent his entire adult life working horses and cattle in the high country, and his reputation as one of the most skilled horse trainers in the Rocky Mountain region had been earned through decades of patient, respectful work with animals. Bobby owned the Diamond Creek Ranch, a modest but well-respected operation that specialized in training, cutting horses and rescuing animals that had been abused or neglected. Unlike many ranchers who viewed horses primarily as working assets, Bobby had always believed that these magnificent creatures deserved to be treated with dignity and care, a philosophy that had sometimes put him at odds with neighbors who prioritized profit over animal welfare. This morning, Bobby was making his weekly ride through the remote sections of his property, checking fence lines and looking for any signs of trouble. The previous week's thunderstorms had washed out several creek crossings, and he wanted to make sure none of his horses had wandered into dangerous territory or gotten trapped by the flooding. As he rounded a bend in the road near the old Henderson Place, a rundown property that had been abandoned for over a year after the previous owner died, Bobby noticed something that made him slam on his brakes and grab his binoculars from the glove compartment. In a small clearing about 200 yards from the road, partially hidden by a stand of aspen trees, Bobby could see what looked like a makeshift corral constructed from rusted fence posts and barbed wire. But it was what was inside that corral that made his blood run cold. A young horse, probably no more than 2 years old, was standing in the center of the enclosure, but the animal was clearly in terrible condition. Even from this distance, Bobby could see that the colt was severely underweight, his ribs showing through a coat that was matted and dull. But what made Bobby's hands shake with rage was the heavy chain that was wrapped around the horse's neck, attached to a stake driven deep into the ground. The chain was short enough that the horse could barely move more than a few feet in any direction, and Bobby could see raw wounds where the metal links had rubbed against the animal's neck and chest. There was no shelter in the makeshift corral, no water visible, and the ground around the stake was trampled into bare dirt, suggesting the horse had been confined there for a considerable time. "Son of a bitch," Bobby muttered, his jaw clenching with anger as he took in the full scope of what he was witnessing. Bobby had seen animal abuse before. It was unfortunately common in rural areas, where some people viewed livestock as disposable property rather than living creatures deserving of care. But this level of deliberate cruelty was beyond anything he'd encountered in his decades of working with horses. The Colt appeared to be a paint horse, with what should have been beautiful markings of brown and white, though the colors were muted by malnutrition and neglect. Despite his obvious suffering, the young horse held his head high with a dignity that spoke to his breeding and spirit. This wasn't some worthless animal that had been abandoned. This was a quality horse that someone had deliberately tormented. Bobby pulled his truck off the road and climbed out, grabbing the wire cutters and rope from his toolbox. As he approached the corral, he could hear the horse's labored breathing and see the fear in the animal's eyes. The colt had clearly learned to associate humans with pain and suffering. "Easy, boy," Bobby said softly, his voice carrying the calm authority that came from a lifetime of working with frightened animals. "I'm here to help you." The horse's ears flicked toward Bobby's voice, but the animal remained tense and ready to flee. Would have, if the chain hadn't prevented any real movement. Bobby could see now that the colt was in even worse condition than he'd initially thought. The animal was severely dehydrated, his eyes sunken and his breathing shallow. Open sores marked where the chain had cut into his flesh, and his hooves hadn't been trimmed in months. This heartbreaking rescue story is just the beginning. You won't believe what Bobby discovers next. Hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories about courage and compassion. Bobby examined the chain more closely and felt his anger intensify. This wasn't some improvised restraint. Someone had deliberately chosen heavy logging chain, the kind used for dragging fallen trees, specifically because it would be impossible for the horse to break. The links were thick enough to anchor a boat, far heavier than anything needed to restrain even a large horse. "Who would do this to you?" Bobby asked quietly, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The Henderson Place had been sold 6 months ago to a man named Vincent Crawford, a wealthy businessman from Denver who'd bought several properties in the valley as investments. Crawford had a reputation for being ruthless in his business dealings, and Bobby had heard rumors that the man had little regard for the livestock that came with the properties he purchased. As Bobby began cutting through the fence wire to create an opening large enough to lead the horse out, he noticed something else that made his stomach turn. Scattered around the corral were the remains of other animals. Bones that looked like they might have belonged to horses or cattle that had died and been left to rot where they fell. This isn't neglect, Bobby realized aloud. This is deliberate torture. Someone hadn't just failed to care for this horse. They had intentionally created conditions designed to cause maximum suffering. The heavy chain, the lack of shelter, the absence of food and water, the isolation from other horses, all of it was calculated to break the animal's spirit through systematic abuse. Bobby had seen enough. He finished cutting the fence and approached the colt slowly, speaking in low, reassuring tones. The horse watched his every movement with eyes that held a mixture of hope and terror, as if he wanted to trust this human, but had learned that trust led only to pain. "I know, boy," Bobby said, extending his hand for the horse to smell. "I know people have hurt you, but that's over now. You're safe." It took Bobby nearly an hour to gain enough of the horse's trust to approach close enough to examine the chain around his neck. What he found made him sick with rage. The chain had been welded shut, meaning it couldn't be removed with simple tools. Someone had deliberately made it impossible for the horse to escape, or for anyone to easily free him. Bobby used his wire cutters to snap the chain as close to the horse's neck as possible, though several links would have to be removed later with proper tools. The moment the weight of the chain was lifted, the colt staggered, clearly weakened by months of carrying the heavy metal around his neck. "Come on, boy," Bobby said, fashioning a makeshift halter from the rope he'd brought. "Let's get you out of here." Leading the emaciated horse toward his truck and trailer took another hour. The colt could barely walk, his legs shaking with exhaustion and malnutrition. Bobby had to stop frequently to let the animal rest, and more than once he thought the horse might collapse entirely. But there was something remarkable about the colt's determination. Despite his obvious suffering, despite months of torture and abuse, the young horse kept moving forward, as if he understood that this human represented his only chance for survival. As Bobby loaded the horse into his trailer and began the drive back to his ranch, he was already making plans. First, he'd call Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the local veterinarian, to get immediate medical attention for the colt. Then he'd contact Sheriff Tom Williams to report the animal abuse. And then, Bobby thought grimly, he was going to make sure that Vincent Crawford faced consequences for what he'd done to this innocent animal. Bobby had no idea that this rescue would spark a confrontation that would divide the entire community of Clearwater Valley, or that the starving colt in his trailer would become the center of a battle between those who saw animals as property to be exploited, and those who believed that cruelty should never be tolerated, regardless of who perpetrated it. As he drove toward home with his injured passenger, Bobby could hear the horse moving restlessly in the trailer, and he found himself talking to the animal through the truck's rear window. "You're going to be okay, boy," he promised. "I don't know what happened to you or why someone wanted to hurt you, but that part of your life is over. From now on, you're going to be treated the way every horse deserves to be treated." The colt seemed to respond to Bobby's voice, and for the first time since the rescue began, Bobby allowed himself to hope that the young horse might not only survive, but eventually learn to trust humans again. It would be a long road to recovery, both physically and emotionally. But Bobby had never backed down from a challenge when an animal's life was at stake. And this horse, this brave, broken, beautiful horse, was going to get every chance Bobby could give him. The reckoning Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived at the Diamond Creek Ranch within an hour of Bobby's call, her veterinary emergency kit in hand, and her expression grim as she took in the condition of the rescued colt. Sarah had been treating animals in Clearwater Valley for 15 years, and she'd seen her share of neglect and abuse. But what she found in Bobby's barn that morning shocked even her experienced eye. "Bobby, this is one of the worst cases I've ever seen," Dr. Mitchell said as she completed her initial examination of the horse. "Severe malnutrition, dehydration, infected wounds from the chain, possible internal damage from stress and starvation. I'm honestly amazed he's still alive." The colt stood quietly in the large stall Bobby had prepared, too weak to resist the examination, but alert enough to watch every movement with wary eyes. Bobby had already provided fresh water and a small amount of high-quality hay, being careful not to overwhelm the horse's damaged digestive system. "What are his chances?" Bobby asked, though he was afraid of the answer. "If we'd found him a week later, I don't think there would have been any chance at all," Dr. Mitchell replied honestly. "As it is, the next 48 hours are critical. His body has been surviving on its own muscle tissue for months. We need to be very careful about how we reintroduce proper nutrition. As Dr. Mitchell worked, cleaning and treating the wounds around the horse's neck and chest, Bobby filled her in on where he'd found the animal and his suspicions about who was responsible. Vincent Crawford, Dr. Mitchell said, her voice carrying a note of disgust. I should have known. That man has bought half the properties in this valley and shown nothing but contempt for the animals that come with them. You've dealt with him before, twice, both times involving horses that were being neglected or mistreated on properties he'd purchased. Both times he claimed he had no knowledge of the animals' condition and hired local guys to dispose of the problem. Dr. Mitchell's fingers worked carefully around the infected chain wounds as she spoke. The man sees animals as nothing more than inconvenient obstacles to his development plans. Bobby felt his anger rising again. Well, he's going to face some consequences this time. I've already called Sheriff Williams. Good, Dr. Mitchell said. Though I should warn you, Crawford has connections. Money, political influence, expensive lawyers. Getting justice for animal abuse cases is never easy, especially when the perpetrator has resources. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of vehicles approaching the ranch interrupted their discussion. Bobby looked out the barn window to see Sheriff Tom Williams pulling up in his patrol car, followed by a black SUV that Bobby didn't recognize. That's Crawford's vehicle, Dr. Mitchell said, her voice tight. How did he know we were here? Bobby walked out to meet the sheriff, with Dr. Mitchell following close behind. Vincent Crawford emerged from his SUV, a man in his 50s, with expensive clothes and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way. With him was another man in a suit, who was clearly a lawyer. Sheriff Williams, Bobby said, extending his hand. Thanks for coming out. Bobby, the sheriff, replied, his expression serious. I understand you found a horse you believe was being mistreated. Not mistreated, Bobby corrected firmly. Tortured, deliberately, and systematically tortured. Crawford stepped forward, his voice carrying the smooth authority of a successful businessman. Sheriff, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Mr. Hayes has apparently taken a horse from my property without permission. That's theft. Your property. Bobby's voice rose with indignation. That horse was chained to a stake with logging chain, starving to death in a makeshift corral with no food, water, or shelter. I was unaware of any horses on that property, Crawford replied calmly. I purchased the Henderson place as an investment. If there were animals there, they were left by the previous owner, and I had no knowledge of their condition. The lawyer stepped forward. My client is prepared to file charges for theft and trespassing. The horse in question belongs to Mr. Crawford as part of his property purchase, and it was removed without his consent. Sheriff Williams looked uncomfortable, clearly caught between his duty to investigate animal abuse and the legal complexities of property rights. Bobby, you said you have evidence of abuse. Look at the horse, Bobby said simply. Dr. Mitchell is treating him right now. The evidence is all over his body. Dr. Mitchell emerged from the barn with photographs she'd taken of the horse's injuries on her phone. Sheriff, this animal has been subjected to months of deliberate torture. These wounds didn't happen by accident. Crawford examined the photos, with apparent shock and concern. This is terrible, he said. I had no idea any animals were in such condition on my property. Sheriff, I want you to investigate this immediately and prosecute whoever was responsible. You're responsible, Bobby said flatly. That horse didn't chain himself. I've owned that property for 6 months, Crawford replied. In that time, I've visited it exactly twice, both times for brief inspections. I have no knowledge of how any animals came to be there, or what conditions they were kept in. The lawyer consulted his notes. Sheriff, my client purchased the Henderson property through an estate sale. Any animals on the property at the time of purchase would have been the responsibility of the estate or previous caretakers. Mr. Crawford cannot be held liable for conditions that existed before he took ownership. Sheriff Williams was clearly struggling with the legal complexities. Bobby, I'm going to need to see the horse and the location where you found him. And Mr. Crawford, you're going to need to prove that you had no knowledge of this animal's condition. Of course, Crawford replied smoothly. I want this matter resolved as much as anyone. However, I do insist that my property be returned. Regardless of the animal's condition, it was taken from my land without permission. Bobby felt his control slipping. Your property. That horse isn't property. He's a living creature that was being tortured to death. In the eyes of the law, horses are livestock, the lawyer interjected. They are property, and removing them without the owner's consent constitutes theft. Dr. Mitchell stepped forward. her professional demeanor barely containing her outrage. "Sheriff, I can provide medical documentation that this horse has suffered months of systematic abuse. The injuries are consistent with prolonged confinement and deliberate neglect." "I appreciate that, Doc," Sheriff Williams said. "But I still need to sort out the legal issues here. Bobby, you're going to have to return the horse to Mr. Crawford's property while we investigate." "Absolutely not," Bobby said firmly. "That horse will die if he goes back there. He needs immediate medical attention and weeks of recovery." Crawford's expression hardened slightly. "Sheriff, are you going to enforce the law or not? That horse was taken from my property without permission. I want it returned immediately." "I'll tell you what," Sheriff Williams said, clearly trying to find a compromise. "The horse stays here while Dr. Mitchell provides medical treatment. But, Bobby, you're responsible for all costs. And Mr. Crawford, you're going to give me access to that property so I can document the conditions." "Unacceptable," the lawyer said immediately. "My client's property rights are being violated. We demand immediate return of the animal, or we'll be forced to take legal action." Bobby looked at the sheriff, then at Crawford and his lawyer, then back at the barn where a tortured horse was fighting for his life. "Sheriff, let me ask you something. If you found a child chained up and starving, would you return him to his abuser while you investigated?" "That's different, Bobby. Children aren't property." "Maybe they shouldn't be either," Bobby replied quietly. "Maybe no living creature should be treated as property when it comes to basic rights like food, water, and freedom from torture." The confrontation was escalating, and Bobby could see that Crawford was prepared to use every legal advantage he had to avoid consequences for what had happened to the horse. But Bobby was equally determined that the young Colt would never again suffer the kind of abuse that had nearly killed him. As the standoff continued in his ranch yard, Bobby realized that this was about more than just one horse. This was about what kind of community Clearwater Valley wanted to be: one that tolerated cruelty when it was profitable or convenient, or one that stood up for the defenseless, regardless of the cost. The battle lines were drawn, and Bobby Hayes was about to discover just how far some people would go to protect their right to treat animals as disposable property. The community response word of the rescued horse and the confrontation at Bobby's ranch spread through Clearwater Valley like wildfire. By the next morning, the story had reached every coffee shop, feed store, and church gathering in the county. And the community's reaction was as divided as Bobby had feared it would be. At Murphy's feed store, the unofficial gathering place for local ranchers and farmers, the conversation was heated and emotional. "Bobby Hayes had no right to take that horse," declared Jim Peterson, who owned one of the larger cattle operations in the valley. "I don't care what condition it was in. You can't just walk onto someone else's property and steal their livestock." "Steal," countered Maria Santos, who ran a small horse rescue operation with her husband. "He saved that animal's life. Would you rather he left it there to die?" "That's not the point," Peterson insisted. "Property rights matter. If we start ignoring them because we don't like how someone treats their animals, where does it end?" Father Michael O'Brien, the priest at St. Mary's Catholic Church, had been listening to the argument with growing concern. "I think we're missing something important here," he said quietly. "This isn't really about property rights. It's about our moral obligations to prevent suffering when we have the power to do so." The debate wasn't limited to the feed store. At the Clearwater Valley Diner, longtime waitress Betty Johnson was fielding similar discussions throughout the morning. "I've known Bobby Hayes for 20 years, said retired teacher Helen Davis. "That man has never done anything that wasn't motivated by genuine compassion for animals. If he says that horse was being tortured, you can take it to the bank." "But what about the legal issues?" asked Bank President Charles Foster. "Crawford might be a difficult man, but he has rights. We can't just ignore the law because we don't like someone." Dr. Mitchell, who was grabbing coffee between appointments, overheard the conversation and decided to add her professional perspective. "I've examined that horse," she said, her voice carrying the authority of medical expertise. "What was done to that animal goes far beyond neglect. Someone deliberately created conditions designed to cause maximum suffering." "How can you be sure it was deliberate?" Foster asked. "Because you don't accidentally wrap logging chain around a horse's neck and weld it shut," Dr. Mitchell replied bluntly. "You don't accidentally create a pen with no food, water, or shelter. Every aspect of that horse's confinement was designed to torture him." The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Vincent Crawford himself, accompanied by his lawyer and two men in expensive suits who had the look of private investigators or security personnel. "Ms. Johnson," Crawford said to the diner owner, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. I understand there's been some discussion about the unfortunate situation at my property. I wanted to clarify a few things for the community. The diner fell silent as Crawford positioned himself where everyone could hear him clearly. First, I want everyone to know that I had no knowledge of any animals being kept in poor conditions on the Henderson property. I purchased that land as an investment, and I rarely visit the remote areas of the property. Father O'Brien looked up from his coffee. Mr. Crawford, if you own the property, aren't you responsible for what happens on it? Father, I own several properties throughout Colorado, Crawford replied. I can't personally monitor every acre of land I own. If animals were left there by previous owners or caretakers, that's not my responsibility. But once you became aware of the situation, what did you do about it? Asked Helen Davis. Crawford's expression hardened slightly. I'm taking appropriate legal action to recover my stolen property and to ensure that property rights are respected. In this community, Dr. Mitchell stood up from her booth. Mr. Crawford, that property you're talking about is a living creature that was being tortured to death. Are you really more concerned about your legal rights than about preventing animal suffering? Doctor, I'm concerned about the rule of law, Crawford replied. If people can simply take property they don't approve of, then none of us are safe from theft justified by moral superiority. The tension in the diner was palpable, and Betty Johnson was beginning to worry that the discussion might turn into something more confrontational. Maybe we should all calm down, she suggested. This is a complex situation, and there are probably good people on both sides. No, said a voice from the back of the diner. Everyone turned to see Tom Bradley, a local mechanic who rarely spoke up in public discussions. There aren't good people on both sides when it comes to torturing animals. There are people who think it's wrong, and people who think it's acceptable as long as you own the animal. Crawford's lawyer stepped forward. Sir, my client is not advocating for animal abuse. He simply wasn't aware of the situation and is now dealing with the theft of his property. Then why isn't he more concerned about finding out who tortured that horse? Bradley asked. Why isn't he working with Sheriff Williams to prosecute whoever was responsible? Instead, he's trying to get the horse back and threatening the man who saved it. Crawford's composure began to slip. I don't have to justify my actions to every mechanic in town. I have property rights, and I intend to enforce them. Father O'Brien stood up, his presence commanding attention. Mr. Crawford, I think what people are struggling with is the disconnect between your legal position and your moral response. Regardless of who was technically responsible for that horse's condition, shouldn't your first concern be making sure the animal receives proper care? My first concern is protecting my legal rights, Crawford replied coldly. If I allow people to steal my property under the guise of animal welfare, where does it end? The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Bobby Hayes himself, who entered the diner with the quiet confidence of a man who knew he'd done the right thing, regardless of the consequences. Bobby, called out Helen Davis. How's the horse doing? He's alive, Bobby replied, accepting a cup of coffee from Betty Johnson. Dr. Mitchell says he's got a fighting chance if we can get proper nutrition into him, without shocking his system. Crawford stepped forward, his lawyer close beside him. Mr. Hayes, I'm prepared to make this simple. Return my horse immediately, and I won't press charges for theft and trespassing. Bobby looked Crawford directly in the eye. That horse isn't going anywhere until he's healthy enough to survive on his own. And when he is healthy, he's not going back to anyone who would treat him the way he was treated. You don't have that choice, the lawyer interjected. The horse is Mr. Crawford's property, and you have no legal right to keep it. Then arrest me, Bobby said calmly. Because I'm not returning that horse to someone who'll torture him. The diner fell silent as the implications of Bobby's statement sank in. He was essentially daring Crawford to have him arrested for animal rescue, knowing that such an arrest would create a public relations nightmare for the businessman. Crawford's expression darkened. Sheriff Williams will be hearing from my attorneys, and I'll be seeking damages for every day my property is unlawfully detained. Good, Bobby replied. Let's get this in front of a judge and see what the law really says about torturing animals. As Crawford and his entourage left the diner, the community was left to grapple with a fundamental question. In a conflict between property rights and animal welfare, which principle should take precedence? The battle for the horse's future was about to become a battle for the soul of Clearwater Valley itself. Justice and redemption 3 weeks after Bobby's rescue of the chained Colt. The Clearwater Valley courthouse was packed with residents who had come to witness what many were calling the most important legal proceeding in the county's history. The case had attracted media attention from across Colorado, with animal rights organizations and property rights advocates, both watching to see how a rural community would balance competing claims of law and morality. Judge Rebecca Martinez, who had presided over the county court for 12 years, entered the courtroom with the grave expression of someone who understood that her decision would set a precedent far beyond this single case. This court is convened to hear the matter of Crawford versus Hayes, Judge Martinez announced, involving the ownership and custody of a horse found in distressed conditions on property owned by the plaintiff. Vincent Crawford sat at the plaintiff's table with his team of expensive lawyers, projecting the confidence of a man who believed the law was clearly on his side. Bobby Hayes sat at the defendant's table with his court-appointed attorney, a young public defender named Lisa Chen, who had taken the case pro bono after being moved by the horses. The courtroom gallery was divided almost evenly between Crawford supporters, mostly business owners and property rights advocates, and those who supported Bobby's rescue efforts. Dr. Mitchell sat in the front row, ready to testify about the horse's condition and treatment. Crawford's lead attorney, Harrison Pike, opened the case with a straightforward property rights argument. Your Honor, this case is fundamentally simple. Mr. Crawford purchased the Henderson property through a legal real estate transaction. Any animals on that property became his property. Mr. Hayes removed that property without permission, which constitutes theft under Colorado law. Pike presented documentation of Crawford's property purchase and argued that regardless of the horse's condition, the animal legally belonged to Crawford and should be returned immediately. The defendant may have had good intentions, Pike continued, but good intentions don't override property rights. If we allow people to take property simply because they disapprove of how it's being treated, we undermine the foundation of property law itself. Bobby's attorney, Lisa Chen, took a different approach in her opening statement. Your Honor, this case isn't really about property rights. It's about Colorado's animal cruelty statutes, which clearly state that animals cannot be subjected to torture or abuse regardless of who owns them. Chen presented photographs of the horse's condition when Bobby found him, including close-ups of the chain wounds and evidence of prolonged starvation. The evidence will show that this animal was subjected to systematic torture that violates both state law and basic human decency. The first witness was Dr. Mitchell, who provided detailed medical testimony about the horse's condition and the nature of his injuries. In my professional opinion, Dr. Mitchell testified, this horse was subjected to months of deliberate abuse. The heavy chain around his neck, the absence of food and water, the lack of shelter, all of these factors together created conditions designed to cause maximum suffering. Crawford's attorney cross-examined Dr. Mitchell aggressively, trying to establish that the horse's condition could have resulted from neglect rather than deliberate abuse. Doctor, isn't it possible that these conditions existed before my client purchased the property? Pike asked. The chain wounds are consistent with recent trauma, Dr. Mitchell replied firmly. This wasn't old damage, this was ongoing abuse that continued for months. The prosecution's case was strengthened when Sheriff Williams testified about his investigation of the Henderson property. We found evidence of other animal remains in the area, Williams reported. Bones from what appeared to be horses and cattle that had died and been left to decompose. Did you investigate who might have been responsible for the animal's care? Chen asked. Mr. Crawford claimed he hired a local man named Jake Morrison to manage the property. But when we tried to locate Morrison, we discovered he'd left the area 6 months ago, Williams replied. Crawford took the stand in his own defense, maintaining his story that he had no knowledge of any animals on the property and no involvement in their care or abuse. I purchased the Henderson property as an investment, Crawford testified. I visited it twice for brief inspections, both times focusing on the main structures. I had no knowledge that any animals were being kept there. But Chen's cross-examination revealed inconsistencies in Crawford's story. Phone records showed that he had been in contact with several local residents about disposing of livestock on his various properties. Financial records indicated payments to individuals for animal removal services. Mr. Crawford, Chen asked, isn't it true that you've made similar payments on other properties you've purchased, always related to removing or disposing of animals? I may have hired people to remove animals that were left behind by previous owners, Crawford admitted reluctantly. And did you ever inquire about the methods used to remove these animals? Crawford's composure began to crack. I assumed they would be handled humanely. The most damaging testimony came from Bobby himself, who described not only the horse's condition, but also Crawford's reaction when confronted with the evidence of abuse. When I showed him the photographs of the horse's injuries, Bobby testified, Mr. Crawford's first concern wasn't about the animal's suffering or about finding who was responsible. His first concern was getting his property back. Crawford's attorney objected, but the damage was done. The courtroom had heard testimony that Crawford showed more concern for his legal rights than for preventing animal suffering. Judge Martinez recessed the court for 2 hours to review the evidence and legal precedents. When she returned, the packed courtroom fell silent. This court has reviewed Colorado animal cruelty statutes, property law precedents, and the specific evidence presented in this case. Judge Martinez began. While Mr. Crawford does have property rights, those rights do not extend to activities that violate state animal cruelty laws. The judge continued. The evidence clearly shows that the horse in question was subjected to conditions that constitute animal abuse under Colorado law. Mr. Hayes's removal of the animal was therefore justified. Under the state's animal protection statutes, Crawford's face darkened as the implications became clear. Furthermore, Judge Martinez said, this court finds that Mr. Crawford, as the property owner, bears responsibility for the conditions on his land. While he may not have personally abused the horse, his failure to ensure proper care constitutes criminal negligence. The judge sentenced Crawford to 6 months in jail, suspended contingent on his payment of all veterinary costs for the horse's treatment, and a substantial fine to be donated to local animal rescue organizations. As for the horse, Judge Martinez concluded, custody is awarded to Mr. Hayes, who has demonstrated both the ability and the commitment to provide proper care. The courtroom erupted in applause from Bobby's supporters, while Crawford and his lawyers huddled in urgent discussion about appeals. Outside the courthouse, Bobby was surrounded by reporters and well-wishers. What will you do with a horse now? Asked a journalist from the Denver Post. First, finish his medical treatment, Bobby replied. Then give him time to learn to trust humans again. He's been through trauma that goes beyond physical abuse. He needs to remember what it feels like to be treated with kindness. Dr. Mitchell joined Bobby on the courthouse steps. How is he doing physically? Better every day, Bobby said with a smile. He's gained 30 pounds. The chain wounds are healing, and yesterday he actually approached me for attention instead of backing away. 6 months later, Bobby stood in his pasture, watching the horse that had once been near death grazing peacefully alongside his other rescued animals. The colt, now named Justice, had grown into a magnificent young stallion, with a coat that gleamed with health and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and trust. He's beautiful, said Sarah Chen, the teacher who had volunteered to help with Bobby's expanding rescue operation. Hard to believe he's the same horse from those terrible photographs. Bobby nodded, his heart full, as he watched Justice run across the pasture with the joy of an animal who had rediscovered what it meant to be free. He teaches me something every day about resilience and forgiveness. Despite everything humans did to him, he's learned to trust again. The case had transformed Clearwater Valley in ways that went far beyond one rescued horse. Crawford's conviction had sent a message that animal abuse would not be tolerated, regardless of the perpetrator's wealth or influence. Property laws had been clarified to ensure that ownership didn't override animal welfare statutes. More importantly, the community had discovered something about itself. When forced to choose between protecting property rights and preventing suffering, the majority of residents had chosen compassion over convenience. Bobby's ranch had become a model for other rescue operations throughout Colorado, and Justice had become a symbol of hope for abused animals everywhere. The horse that had once been chained and starving was now healthy, happy, and living proof that even the most broken spirits could heal when treated with patience and love. As Bobby walked across the pasture toward Justice, the horse lifted his head and approached, no longer the fearful, broken animal that had been found in chains, but a confident, trusting creature who had learned that not all humans were cruel. Thank you, boy, Bobby said softly, stroking the horse's neck where the chain scars had faded to thin white lines, for reminding us all what we're capable of when we choose to do what's right. If this powerful story about courage, justice, and standing up for the innocent moved you, smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories about people who risk everything to protect those who can't protect themselves. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that one person really can make a difference when they refuse to look away from suffering. Comment below and tell us about a time when you had to choose between what was easy and what was right. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest inspiring stories about the power of compassion. Remember, sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with the simple refusal to let cruelty go unchallenged.